So here we've got our panels that we did the shrink test with. If you remember from back then, that's, I don't know, probably 3 months ago or so, we did this. We did the shrink test on these panels, and then I took a DA and sanded them all down to bare metal in the middle. Basically what I'm experimenting with here is creep. I'm trying to see if the rust that's gonna form on this bare metal is actually going to drive underneath the primer and start lifting it off, make it easy to scrape off, any things like that. And as you can see, some of these primers, not all of these primers, are technically a DTM primer. We did mix some spray polys in here for the shrink test part of things. And this is not a lab test. So many people, oh, you tested it in a lab. Our product has gone through the lab testing. This, I want to do. I want to see what happens when I do this. I want to see what happens when I do a shrink test in a real world scenario. I want to see what happens if I sand it down to bare metal in a spot, leave it outside for 3 months. I want to see what happens. This is not a lab test, and that's the entire point of doing this little bit of testing. We're trying to take it a little bit beyond. We're testing it in the lab, we're testing it outside the lab. So our manufacturer has done all the lab testings and things with the primer, all the salt spray test, all of that. So now I'm testing it. This is not a lab test. Never claimed it to be a lab test, but this is a good real world scenario. So this is our CRE panel. This is CRE 921. And basically what I'm gonna do is the first thing I'm gonna do is just scrape this. Where this rust is, we're gonna scrape and see how much, if any, of the primer around the rust comes off. See, like right here, there's primer. This is my primer line. If I scrape this, where that primer is, there's actually rust underneath of it, and it's peeling off very easily because that rust is creeping underneath of it. And another thing that you might notice is on the edge, the back sides of these are bare metal. They're rusty. They were sitting in the ground outside in the weather. Right along the edge, see how it's bubbling? It's just barely starting to bubble, just little bubbles all along the edge. That's because that rust is starting to creep around the corner and under. So this is the SPI panel. We're gonna do the same thing. Just gonna start scraping. A little bit of the same thing. I would say it's better than the CRE though. It's not as far out from the rust. But a little bit of the same thing. It's kind of scraping off here and there. There's a little bit of rust underneath of it. See right there. So I'll go to this side. I'll go right off of this little line here. See, I scraped all of this little area off and it's brown underneath. That's because it's starting to creep underneath. And again, with the edge, you can see the rust is kind of starting to creep around, starting to bubble underneath that primer. If I scrape this off the edge, that's rusting. That's rust, all rust. See, this is popping right off right here because it's rusty. So this is our feather fill panel. I'm a little bit curious to see, being that this is not actually a DTM primer. As you can see, it scrapes off much easier than the epoxies in general. It's actually not too rusty under here, but there is rust. I'm scraping, I'm hitting blisters and peeling the tops of those blisters off right here. These are all little rust blisters forming. And same thing on the edges. You can see all the rust forming, starting to creep up around the edges. So this is the Tamco epoxy. Same thing, we're gonna start scraping. Wow, that came off. See that flake right there? It's just flaking right off. So, yeah, that's flaking right off. Look at this, all of this rust was underneath primer. So if I come over here, actually, I haven't even scraped on this side yet. If you look at this right here, you can actually see all those little bubbles. You can see that primer has already started to lift off. So I bet when I scrape this, it's gonna come right off. Yep, one scrape. I took that much off. Rust, rust. So this is our slick sand panel. Again, a spray poly, not a DTM primer. The reason we threw a few spray polys in with this particular test was when we were doing the shrink test. And it's interesting to see what they will do over bare metal, not being a DTM primer. They probably hold up better than you think. So here we go. Same thing. One little scrape, I've got brown under where my primer was. If I scrape this a little more, all that is rust. So this is our rust defender, all you need rust defender panel. And as you can see, same thing as a lot of the other primer. It's kind of starting to creep up around that edge. So let's see what happens here. That stuff scraped right off. Black rust, black rust, black rust. It's scraping off fairly easily, but there's not as much rust as some of the other panels. Like I said, most of it is, there's a spot there, a little spot over here, a couple tiny spots here. So this is KD3000. This is a hybrid epoxy, and as you can see, we're getting some rust creeping around the edges and things. So let's scrape on this, see what happens. You can see how easily it comes off, and you can see, probably even with my fingernail, I can actually keep taking it off, and look at all the brown that's underneath that. This is all these brown dots. That was what is actually underneath that primer on the edge of where I sanded it. And that's the whole purpose of this. We're trying to see if we know it's gonna rust here. That's the whole purpose of it. We're trying to see how far that rust will creep underneath these primers. And last but not least, L411. As you can see, the edge looks pretty nice. It's really not creeping around the edge. I mean, it's sticking pretty dang good. And our rust is literally just right on the edge of where it's rusting. That's the only place it's coming off. It's not coming off a 1/4 inch in like a lot or more like a lot of the other ones. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a razor blade and I'm gonna cut a very close, like a tic-tac-toe pattern. I'm gonna do like 5 lines this way, 5 lines this way. We're trying to just make tiny squares of product that are stuck to the metal. So as you can see, now I've got a bit of a little grid there. And now I'm gonna scrape this, and we're gonna see how well it actually sticks. If all these little squares pop off, not really sticking the greatest. If they all stay, great. Not bad. I'm not gonna say that that's bad at all. I'm pushing on this very hard. I'm trying to scrape this off. So this is KD3000, same thing. Better than I expected. I would say this is probably sticking better than the rust defender. That must be just kind of the top layer, the skin that I was seeing, but better than I expected. I would say it's fair. Clausen All You Need panel, the non-DTM version. Here. That actually stuck pretty well. I'm surprised. Stuck pretty well. I wasn't even able to get a square off of the panel. I was more or less sanding it with the edge of the screwdriver, and then none of it came off. So here we've got the slick sand panel. Do the same thing. Not bad, especially not being a DTM. We took 3 squares off. That's not too bad. This is the Tamco epoxy panel. So let's see what happens. Oh, wow. That's not very impressive. I did 2 swipes. I took 8 squares off right away. This is Feather Fill G2 spray poly, not a DTM primer, but like I said, it's interesting to know, interesting to see. Some of these primers have stuck a lot better than I expected them to. For example, this stuck a lot better than I expected to. I took sections of squares off, but I really didn't take any complete squares off, and it didn't come off in a square grid pattern like a lot of the other ones. A square would come off, this square would come off, this square would come off. You can see it flaking off. I'm actually a little impressed with the spray poly's adhesion to bare metal, but not the corrosion protection. So here we've got the SPI panel. We're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna cut it. There we go. Let's see what happens here. I would say very good adhesion to bare metal. It is a DTM epoxy. I would say that very good. Here we've got our CRE panel. Here we go. Pretty decent. It came off a little bit around a few of the gouges, but I mean, really pretty good. Here's the L411 panel. I'm gonna cut this. So there I've got my grid. Excellent adhesion to bare metal. Reasons why this primer has excellent adhesion to bare metal: there's not a lot of creep as far as rust creeping under it. If you get a rock chip or something and it starts to rust, it's not going to creep under it nearly as much as a lot of the other primers. This primer is not a private label primer. This is a custom formulation specifically for us. We do not obviously make it in our shop. This is made by chemists that have 40 plus years experience between the two of them. They know what they're doing. So this primer also has rust encapsulation properties. So what that means is when I strip this metal, when I strip a panel down to bare metal, within 30 minutes it's starting to rust. It doesn't matter, humidity, whatnot. Within 30 minutes you're getting micro particles of rust, micro blisters of rust on your bare metal. And when that happens, if you don't use a primer with rust encapsulation properties, it can rust later down the road. You will not see it. It is at a microscopic level, but this will lock that down. This will neutralize it. It will kill it. That's what rust encapsulation means. This primer also has moisture scavenger properties. So say I'm spraying, it's a hot, humid summer day, it's 100 degrees and 90% humidity. When I bring these panels in here, they're probably going to have some humidity on them. They are colder than the air around them. They're gonna have a very small amount of, I'll say, sweat. I know a lot of seen some videos where people will take a torch, like a propane torch or something, and heat the metal in humid environments, and you can actually watch the moisture come out of that metal. What moisture scavengers do, they make it, you don't have to do that. If you have a little bit of humidity on your panel, this primer will actually attack it and force it to the surface, force it to dry off the panel, so you do not lock humidity under your primer.